Hello, my name is Jaden. Hold on, I have a better idea. So, I thought it would be fitting if I used this little puppet version of myself because that's what today's topic is going to be about. Why do we feel fear when watching horror media? After all, we know it's not real, but our brains still convince us that what we're seeing on the screen is a real threat, activating our biological fight, flight, or freeze response. The power of film has in evoking fear purely through visual and sound is remarkable. Associate Professor of Psychology AJ Setpute explains how horror films show us a mirror of the world that is distorted and terrifying, and yet somehow feels right. This exact distortion of what we see brings me to the topic of today's video. As you can probably tell, stop-motion animation is definitely a special interest of mine. There is something so magical and fascinating about the time and detailed craftsmanship that goes into making every single frame. I'm an animation student, and trust me when I say that stop-motion animation is one of the most slow and meticulous processes out of any other medium. Because in order to make a smooth, nice-looking animation, you have to make tiny incremental movements to your puppet, and it takes hours just to get a few seconds of animation. Like during the production of Leica's Kubo and the Two Strings, it would take them a whole week just to produce 3.31 seconds of animation. And that isn't even taking into account the time that it takes to build the puppets, the sets, and when they inevitably break apart mid-shoot, which they always do, you may have to start all over again. What I'm trying to say is that it is a painfully long process. So when I see short films or even feature-length films made in stop motion, I am always in awe of the pure passion and dedication it would take to have produced that. So in this video, I will be going over the history of stop motion horror and investigate what aspects of the medium make it fit so well into the horror genre. And just as a quick content warning, obviously the horror media that I'm going to describe and show, while purely fictional and pieces of art, can be pretty uncomfortable and disturbing. So viewer discretion is advised. The history of stop motion begins in the late 1800s with the earliest documented stop motion animation believed to be the 1898 piece The Humpty Dumpty Circus by J. Stuart Blackton and Albert E. Smith. Unfortunately, it is considered to be lost media as no surviving footage besides this single frame has been found. Almost a decade later, J. Stuart Blackton went on to make a film in 1907 called The Haunted Hotel that was a silent comedy film featuring stop motion about ghosts moving furniture to scare a visitor. Many other silent films around this time integrated similar stop motion techniques as special effects, often for comedic or paranormal effect. In Eastern Europe around this time, Polish-Russian animator Ladislas Steyrovich was believed to pioneer the first use of stop-motion puppet animation through his inventive yet morbid process involving stag beetles. He was fascinated by insects and wanted to document them. However, he found that it was not possible to film them as the bright studio lights would stun them or even kill them. So he took an approach similar to taxidermy and inserted wires into the carcasses in order to animate them. While there is obviously a sadness to this fact, I also think that it speaks to what would turn out to be a long fascination of morbid curiosity and a sway towards the horror genre and stop motion itself. The macabre nature of the subject matter actually ties into the definition of anime, which literally means to bring to life, which symbolically I think he did achieve through his storytelling. The next biggest trend in the 20s and 30s, particularly in the US, was what I would describe as creature features. Notably, the famous dinosaur and big monster films such as The Lost World 1925 and King Kong 1933, credited mostly to Willis O'Brien. These were massive successes in the world of cinema. Over these years, there was particular focus on dinosaurs and other monster-like creatures due to puppets being the only and most realistic way of showing people how extinct prehistoric creatures might have looked like and moved. Ray Harryhausen, of course, was a highly influential stop-motion animator and was 13 when he went to watch King Kong in theaters. In his memoir, he describes how he was so inspired by the film that he went to go on to art school and reach out to O'Brien as a mentor, which he accepted. Ray Harryhausen went on to contribute to the stop-motion visual effects of science fiction, fantasy, and creature films into the following decades, and had a highly successful long career. The 1950s and decades after saw a rise in popularity of science fiction films, particularly influenced by the Cold War through scientific development of the atomic bomb and the space race. Alien invasion concepts were also really popular. Less known was that a part of that popularity was due to the US pushing anti-communist propaganda during a time known as the Red Scare. As a result of this, many of these films required stop-motion special effects to create these alien creatures. This reliance on stop-motion in sci-fi would continue even up until the earliest Star Wars movies with the work of the incredible Phil Tippett. This is because they relied primarily on the puppets and miniatures to make their special effects prior to the takeover of CGI. So as you now know, the US was experiencing an influx of science fiction media. While all the creepy monsters we've seen so far are definitely in line with horror, I want to step away from the US for a second to talk about an artist whose work actually makes my skin crawl, Jan Svankmajer. In the 50s and 60s, Czechoslovakian animation was highly experimentative and dark as a result of the ease of film censorship in the post-Stalin era. Prior to Svankmajer's work was another prominent Czech stop-motion animator called Jiří Trinka. He made several puppet animated films, all of which hold an eerie style and tone. The Hand, 1965, was one of his most famous short films where a sculptor is approached by a human hand that commands him to make a statue against his will, an obvious commentary on the recent culture of authoritarianism. Jan Svankmajer's work, on the other hand, is a much more disturbing and surrealist style. The way he distorts the human form in clay is nothing less than nightmarish. His absurd and crude concepts often contain no dialogue or context, just watching as the themes of macabre and the human condition unfold. His realistic sculpting skills combined with low saturated sets are so visually unsettling, with no way of predicting what will happen. Yet I think his work is one of the best examples of stop-motion horror I have seen. Part 4. The transition to CGI. Into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, stop-motion trends of absurdism, fantasy, sci-fi, and dinosaurs continues ever strong. Stop-motion is thriving as the lead VFX in live-action films until it reached a turning point on the production of Jurassic Park. Phil Tippett was originally assigned to animating the dinosaurs in stop-motion. However, when Steven Spielberg saw the first CGI tests, he told Tippett, "You're out of the job," to which Tippett replied, "Don't you mean extinct?" The switch was made using CGI, but Tippett was still heavily involved with the film, particularly in how the transition could be made easy with stop motion as reference. This ultimately welcomed the modern era of digital VFX. And then of course you have the wave of children's gothic horror films in the 90s and 2000s, such as the work of Tim Burton and Laika. So looking back on everything, despite an entire century of changing genres, methods, and technology, it's hard to not notice an obvious continuity of creepy subject matter, regardless of what time it was. Whether it was ghosts, bugs, dinosaurs, monsters, or creepy human-like creatures or dolls. And then of course the themes of absurdism, death, fear, violence, always somehow resurface in stop motion. But why? Why, after all this time, is horror such an important part of stop-motion history? To understand what aspects make stop-motion so unsettling, I've broken it down into two core concepts: the uncanny valley and texture. The term Bukimi no Tani, translated as uncanny valley, was coined by Masahiro Mori, who was a robotics professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology in the 1970s. While the term uncanny had already been analysed in previous history, his published theory is highly influential in its relation to robotics design. His theory was that the more human-like a robot or inanimate object was, the more uncanny or uncomfortable it made people feel. It is represented on a line graph visualizing the connection between familiarity and human-likeness, with the valley being a downward slope of what lies in the middle between human and machine. It's the same reason why dolls and clowns are always depicted as creepy, because they resemble human faces, but their proportions are just a little bit off. He also emphasizes how adding movement changes the shape of the uncanny valley by exaggerating the peaks and valley, as for creatures, including robots, movement is generally a sign of life. Cognitive scientist Aisha Saigin also speaks to this theory, stating, "If you look human-like, but your motion is jerky, or you can't make proper eye contact, those are the things that make them uncanny." So when comparing all this with stop motion and its janky movement, it's easy to say that the medium definitely lies within the uncanny valley. Another aspect besides unnatural movement that makes the style part of the uncanny valley is its range of proportions. Stop motion has no one specific style, it's a spectrum of highly exaggerated and stylized to highly realistic. On one end, you have humanoid characters with large or small facial features that feel right but can also feel odd. And then on the other end is super realistic puppets, often with realistic eyes, such as Isle of Dogs and Anomalisa, that tend to stick more towards realistic human proportions. The style of Anomalisa in particular really sticks out to me in that regard. The puppets are so uncanny in their realism, yet the only obvious way of telling that they are puppets is the line on their faces separating where their mouth replacements go. The film even plays into that aspect metatextually. This ultimate connection to reality brings me to my next point: texture. Another reason why stop motion works so well in the horror genre is the centrality on texture in evoking emotional responses. For example, soft textures like fabric and wool and felt can often evoke feelings of comfort, innocence, and relaxation, while sticky or slimy textures can evoke fear or disgust. Eden Gallery, a contemporary fine art gallery with locations in the US and Europe, explains how art with rich texture does more than captivate the eyes, it connects us to a piece on a visceral level. This sensory engagement reminds us that art is not just a visual experience, it is an invitation to explore, imagine, and feel. While CGI continues to become increasingly better at depicting realistic textures, especially in film and games, there is something so unique and special about stop motion with the fact that everything on screen has a real, tactile surface. This is because the element of texture in visual art can be broken down into two categories: visual texture and tactile texture. Visual texture is the illusion of texture created by an artist through shading, drawing, or painting to make a surface appear like it has texture when in reality the surface is flat. For example, in CGI texturing, skin can be textured either through using a photo of skin or by painting it on to depict skin. Regardless, it is treated as a separate layer of the 3D model and doesn't actually change the surface itself. On the other hand, tactile texture is when there is a real physical texture that can be felt when you touch it. Any real-life surface, sculpture, or in this case puppets, is made up of real textures. In horror films, texture is used all the time to frighten us, particularly in the world of gory makeup and special effects. So when you look at stop motion, a huge part of that medium itself is tactile texture. It is always going to evoke a range of strong reactions, whether positive or negative. Some people don't react as much as I do to texture, which is partially due to my personal relationship with texture. Autism. So, I'm autistic, if you couldn't tell by everything I've said so far. And despite being the older sibling out of 3 other autistic kids, I was the last to be diagnosed. Technically, I was diagnosed at 13, but wasn't told until I was 16. And of course I was angry and upset at first for not being told sooner. But it all makes sense now, and I've had time to rediscover my identity and why my brain works the way it does, which is great. So as someone who is both artistic and autistic, yeah, I know those words sound very similar, I not only have a technical understanding of texture from an art point of view, but I'm also more aware of my emotional responses due to my sensory sensitivities. I love seeking out different textures, both in real life and in animated media. For me personally, soft, smooth, and rough textures bring me joy, while very specific textures like velvet, cotton wool, and cornstarch for some reason make me want to scratch my skin off. But it's also important to mention that autism is a spectrum and everyone experiences sensory sensitivities differently. Just because one thing feels nice to me doesn't mean the next person won't want to rip their skin off too when they touch it or even think about touching it. And that's cool. Stop-motion horror projects, even if not specifically in the horror genre, have a really strong basis of manipulating people's reaction to texture to evoke fear or disgust. This can be particularly effective when soft or smooth textures are juxtaposed against opposite textures. The anime series Beastars has a stop-motion intro sequence that I absolutely love. The cute needle-felted puppets and tiny outfits are adorable and evoke the same feeling of happiness when you look at a fluffy animal or toy. But there's a striking jump from this sense of pure innocence and whimsy to this dark scene showing a close-up of his guilty, bloodshot eyes, and what is depicted as a wet pool of blood. Using textures that feel out of place, such as liquids, in a primarily solid world, always manages to stand out in a creepy way. Phil Tippett's 30-year-long project Mad God was finally released in 2021. This no-dialogue horror film is hard to describe outside of brutal and disgusting, yet incredibly impressive. It uses visuals to depict humanity as primal, violent creatures, and despite no clear plot, it manages to evoke themes of the human condition, cruelty, mortality, and hope. It is the beauty and the horror of this use of texture that makes films like this so grotesque and fascinating to experience. So, what's the point? If 3D can give us hyper-realistic depictions of texture, why do we need stop motion anymore? Well, yes, it's obviously true, stop motion isn't nearly as popular as it was decades before. CGI is simply more efficient, quicker, and profitable to big studios. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but when you look at all the live-action Disney remakes, which are mostly just CGI, it's very hard to feel any sort of passion or uniqueness that went into the visual style or storytelling. Over the past few years, it's apparent that these big studios have lost the creative motivation and have resorted to treating animation as just a product to be sold as a business, which as an animator is really sad. So I think that's why we need stop motion now more than ever. In the age of AI, artists like myself are terrified of being replaced in the industry. But despite all the time and imperfections of stop motion, there is a beauty in it that AI can never replace. Clay leaves behind fingerprints.